It's 3 a.m., February 24th, 2022. Russian Tupolev Tu-95 strategic bombers, loaded with Ka-101 cruise missiles, are heading to their missile launch points. Soon, they will fire the first missile salvo at the targets across Ukraine. A few hours later, Russian paratroopers from the 31st and 45th Brigades will begin boarding Mi-8 and Mi-24 helicopters that will take them from southern Belarus to Hostomel airport in Ukraine's Kyiv Oblast. There, they will take part in one of the fierce battles of the war. Along its entire border with Ukraine and in Belarus, Russia accumulated approximately 175,000 troops, along with Rosgvardia units, heavy equipment and aviation assets. But before the border is crossed, before first missiles are launched, and before the first Russian paratrooper sets its foot at the Hostomel, there are still 24 hours. 24 hours of hope, diplomatic efforts, military preparations, and prayers. This is the story of the last 24 hours before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A sun hasn't yet risen over the sleepy streets of the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. But the coming day won't be, by any chance, calm or peaceful. It's been a few months already since Russia has begun its unprecedented military build-up around the borders with Ukraine. Russian government has unleashed an aggressive propaganda campaign against Kyiv. The Ukrainians are blamed for violating the ceasefire with separatists, shelling civilians, and even conducting genocide in the Donbas region.
Позволю себе только добавить, что по нашим оценкам, то, что происходит на Донбассе сегодня, это и есть геноцид.
The United States are sounding alert of the imminent threat of Russian invasion.
But the fact remains, Russian troops currently have Ukraine surrounded from Belarus along the Russian border and with Ukraine to the Black Sea in the south and all of its border. You know, look, we have reason to believe the Russian forces are planning to and intend to attack Ukraine in the coming week, in the coming days. We believe that they will target Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million innocent people.
And I now want to take a moment to echo what both President Biden and Secretary Blinken have already said. We encourage all American citizens who remain in Ukraine to depart immediately. We want to be crystal clear on this point. Any American in Ukraine should leave as soon as possible, and in any event in the next 24 to 48 hours. We obviously cannot predict the future. We don't know exactly what is going to happen, but the risk is now high enough, and the threat is now immediate enough, that this is what prudence demands.
That morning, the atmosphere of war could have been felt not only by politicians and military commanders, but also by ordinary Ukrainians. Dmitro from Kharkiv recalls, "In the morning, I arrived at the Kharkiv airport for a flight to Kyiv to attend a legal forum on criminal law. It was a frosty but very sunny start to the day. And then, for some reason, I caught myself thinking that this beauty wouldn't last forever. Then I noticed the absence of planes on the parking lots. Victoria, a teacher from Chernihiv Oblast, recollects, "A student ran into my office and started crying that her father had been taken to war. I reassured her and said that there was no war and there would be no war. Maybe she didn't understand something. But, in fact, on February 23rd, the first territorial defense units were being formed." Alexander from Kharkiv remembers, "We gathered as a family and repeated the action plan in case of an attack by the Russians on Kharkiv. We once again checked our documents, backpacks, bags and a week's worth of food that we would take with us during evacuation. Shortly after 8 a.m., Ukrainian emergency services are dispatched to the Russian consulate in the city of Lviv in western Ukraine. Upon arrival, Ukrainian responders notice that the consulate employees have been burning something in a barrel, presumably documents. The firefighters are not let inside, but a consulate representative comes out to them and assures them that everything is fine. In southern Belarus, an unusual deployment of dozens of Russian Kamov Ka-52 and Mi-24 helicopters is noticed in the area of the R-35 highway, around 30 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. During his visit to Kyiv over 1 month before, the CIA director William J. Burns had warned the Ukrainian authorities that the Russians could try to capture the Hostomel airport in Kyiv Oblast in the opening stages of the invasion. The concentration of Russian military helicopters over 100 kilometers north of Hostomel might indicate that the Russians are indeed preparing for such a bold maneuver. Shortly before 10 a.m., a statement appears on the official page of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, in which Ukrainian citizens are recommended to immediately leave Russia and refrain from any travel to this country in the future. That coincides in time with the announcement about the introduction of additional security restrictions in the areas around the border with Russia. According to the Ukrainian Border Guard Service, such measures are implemented in order to prevent destabilization of the situation on the border. The graveness of the situation is further indicated by the conscription of reservists aged from 18 to 60. In Kyiv, the members of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine gather to discuss the prospect of introducing the martial law across the country. The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, and Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov are strong advocates of such decision. But the majority of participants are against it, voicing fears that it might give Russia a casus belli as it could blame Ukraine for escalating the situation. Ultimately, the martial law is not approved in the morning of February 23rd, with the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Oleksiy Danilov, submitting a presidential decree to the Verkhovna Rada, which only mentions a state of emergency throughout the country. In Russia-controlled areas of the Lugansk and Donetsk regions of Ukraine, the mobilization of the local population is in full swing. Men aged from 18 to 55 are rounded up on the streets by people in military fatigues and sent to the concentration points. As the presidents of Poland and Lithuania, Andrzej Duda and Gitanas Nausėda, meet with Ukrainian President Zelensky, a few kilometers away, the Russians begin the evacuation of their embassy in Ukraine's capital. As the Russian flag is lowered down, some of the Ukrainians, who perhaps at this point have no illusions left that their neighbors are up to something sinister, leave their messages on the fence. The previous days saw the evacuations of Russian consulates in the Ukrainian cities of Odessa and Lviv. With the closure of the main embassy in Kyiv, Russian diplomatic presence in Ukraine ceases completely.
Прикінцеві та перехідні положення Бюджетного кодексу України. Я пропоную проголосувати про включення до порядку денного цього питання. Будь ласка, шановні колеги, прошу голосувати.
The Ukrainian parliament officially approves the law on the so-called wartime budget. This law will allow the Cabinet of Ministers and President to redistribute state budget funds to the armed forces of Ukraine promptly, without the need of waiting for the parliament approval. Russian President Putin holds a phone call with Turkish President Erdogan. Putin tells the Turkish leader that the recognition of Lugansk and Donetsk separatist republics by Russia 2 days ago was necessary given Ukraine's aggression in Donbas and categorical refusal to implement the Minsk agreements. Russian president also expresses his dissatisfaction with NATO and US response to Russia's legitimate concerns and demands. Turkish President Erdogan calls Russia's decision to recognize the separatist republics unacceptable and violating Ukraine's territorial integrity. Around 5 p.m., a wave of luxury cars begins to fill the Bankova and Luteranska streets in the vicinity of the presidential office in Ukraine's capital. The owners of 50 largest companies in Ukraine, the richest people in the country, are heading for the unprecedented meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky. When one of the participants spots Władysław Czekotkin, the co-founder and co-owner of the Ukrainian online retailer Rozetka, he doesn't hesitate and throws a joke. Vlad, do you know why the Russians won't break through to Kyiv? Because they will get stuck in the Rozetka warehouses. The others, including Czekotkin, laugh wholeheartedly as they wait for the meeting to commence. But the atmosphere becomes more serious and tense when the president and other Ukrainian officials finally arrive. The businessmen are briefed on the current situation. President Zelensky asks them to help the state and support the economy in this difficult moment. General Zaluzhny tells them that the army is ready for any course of action. When the meeting concludes at around 6 p.m., the majority of the participants appear to be leaving the presidential office assured and calm.
Ми ж тут, нікуди не поїдемо.
Ukrainian authorities have decided to strengthen the security in the coastal city of Mariupol in Donetsk Oblast. The city is expected to be one of the immediate targets of any Russian offensive action, as it lies approximately 12 kilometers from the current contact line with separatist forces in Donbas. Some of the stores in Mariupol are being closed indefinitely. A witness from the Reuters news agency spots the movement of at least 2 military columns heading in the direction of Russia-controlled city of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. A senior US defense official tells Reuters that Russia has approximately 80% of troops assembled around Ukraine in attack positions. He is as ready as he can be. We have been saying any day now, and it's certainly possible that today is that day. US President Joe Biden officially announces that the United States will be imposing sanctions on the company in charge of building Russia's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline in the Baltic Sea. These steps are another piece of our initial tranche of sanctions in response to Russia's actions in Ukraine. As I have made clear, we will not hesitate to take further steps if Russia continues to escalate. Biden notes in the statement.
Про затвердження указу президента України про введення надзвичайного стану в окремих регіонах України. Шановні колеги, готові голосувати? Прошу народних депутатів голосувати.
The Ukrainian parliament approves the presidential bill on the introduction of the state of emergency across Ukraine for 30 days. The state of emergency will officially come into force by midnight. Meanwhile, something is happening in the Crimea. Ukrainian authorities report that the Russians are evacuating the entire night shift from the Titan chemicals plant located in Armyansk in the northern part of the Crimean Peninsula. The Ukrainians, including Foreign Minister Kuleba, as well as military intelligence, point to the possibility that the Russia might be preparing another provocation, aka false flag operation. Around the same time, a large Russian military column is spotted heading in the direction of Armyansk. Kremlin spokesman Peskov announces that the heads of the Lugansk and Donetsk separatist republics have officially turned to Russian President Putin with an appeal to help them repelling what they called an aggression by the armed forces of Ukraine. Kyiv continues to increase its military presence along the line of contact while receiving comprehensive support, including military aid, from the United States and other Western countries. The Kyiv regime is focused on a military solution to the conflict. The appeals to Putin read:
У нас найкраща армія в світі.
In a video statement, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, declares that the Ukrainians are ready to meet invading Russian troops with force.
Ми дуже працьовиті і дуже талановиті. Але якщо ворог пройде на нашу землю, ми будемо вбивати. Слава Україні!
All major airports in Ukraine are being closed for regular traffic. The runways are being blocked with tractors, trailers and other pieces of equipment to prevent Russian landings. Ukraine requests an urgent meeting of the United Nations Security Council due to the appeal of the heads of the separatist republics to Putin to provide them military assistance. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba calls the appeal a further escalation of the security situation. French government calls its citizens to leave Ukraine without any delay.
Пакет економічних законів, економічний патріотизм. Дякую всім, хто допомагає Україні. Працюємо далі. А дальше по-русски. Сегодня я инициировал телефонный разговор с президентом Российской Федерации.
Ukrainian President Zelensky appears in front of the cameras and says that he attempted to call Putin but received no response. Speaking in Russian, Zelensky addresses the citizens of Russia.
К российским гражданам, как гражданин Украины. С вами нас разделяет более 2000 километров общей границы. Вдоль нее сегодня стоят ваши войска, почти 200 тысяч солдат, тысячи боевых машин. Ваше руководство одобрило их шаг вперед на территорию другой страны. И этот шаг может стать началом большой войны на европейском континенте. Мы точно знаем, нам не нужна война, ни холодная, ни горячая, ни гибридная. Но если на нас будут наступать войска, если у нас попытаются отнять нашу страну, нашу свободу, наши жизни, жизни наших детей, мы будем защищаться. Не наступать, защищаться. Наступая, вы будете видеть наши лица, не наши спины, наши лица.
Russia closes the airspace along its entire border with Ukraine for civilian traffic. Meanwhile, a US Air Force RQ-4 Global Hawk Strategic Reconnaissance UAV continues its surveillance mission over Ukraine, tracking Russian military movements in the border areas. Soon, it will return to its base in Italy, becoming the last publicly tracked NATO aircraft that ever appeared over Ukraine.
Being here. Do you have reason to believe that before this night is over, Russian forces will be engaged in something akin to a full invasion of Ukraine?
I do. Unfortunately, Russia has positioned its forces at the final point of readiness across Ukraine.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken tells NBC News that he believes that Russia will unleash major aggression against Ukraine in the coming hours.
Look, I can't put a date or an exact time on it, but everything is in place for Russia to move forward.
The first round of sanctions has apparently not deterred President Putin.
Ukraine closes its entire airspace for civilian traffic. It's 3 a.m., February 24, 2022. Russian Tupolev Tu-95 strategic bombers, loaded with Ka-101 cruise missiles, are heading to their missile launch points. Soon, they will fire the first missile salvo at the targets across Ukraine. And the lives of millions of people, both in Ukraine and Russia, will be irrevocably changed forever.